I know on this channel I have done my fair share of abusing the clip from the Borg.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships.
Which sounds like a crazy science fiction meme at this point. But sadly, in 2019, in the upside down that we all live in, this is something that you have talking heads on mainstream media outlets just openly saying, we're going to be the Borg. That's inevitable. That's the way it's going in society.
It's very Star Trek. Right? You remember the movie where the cyber, what was it? It was Star Trek.
Leave it to Adam to bring up Star Trek, by the way.
You know, the half human, half computer kind of thing.
The Borg.
The Borg, thank you.
Borg.
Right, yeah.
I mean, do you really want to go there? I understand people want to enhance.
It's going to happen at some point.
Resistance is futile.
It's going to happen at some point.
You actually have scientists in books that were published back during the counterculture openly talking about this, unbelievably, saying this is the goal for humanity. This is where we all as a society should head in the next stage of our directed human evolution. And so somebody on Twitter said I should read this book because I wasn't going to believe it. And I had to go check it out at the library because it's incredibly expensive to get a copy of this book. So I had to check this out at the library, which luckily had a copy. But this book is called The Prometheus Project by Gerald Feinberg, and it was published in 1969. And this guy, his bio says he's a professor of physics at Columbia. He received a BA, an MA, and PhD from there. He spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Physics in Princeton and 2 years at Brookhaven, there on Long Island, home of the RHIC Collider, and then a year at Rockefeller University, which probably helped cement the ideas that he's promoting in this book. But he's been published all over the place. Scientific American, the Annual Review of Nuclear Physics, Science at V, lots of others. He's written whole books on quantum physics. In fact, this guy coined the term tachyon, the hypothetical faster-than-light particles. He also predicted the existence of the muon neutrino, and he sat on the advisory panel for the Foresight Institute in Palo Alto, which is a huge promoter of nanotechnology.
AI, cyberspace, neurotechnology, health technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, cryptocommerce, and space.
And other transhumanist technologies.
Our big dumb universe is a supersaturated solution for intelligence. We get to be the seed crystal, the time that determines what kind of crystal we are, to be the seed crystal.
And I think it's interesting that this particular book was published by Doubleday. It's a very mainstream publisher, and it's obvious that this was a message they wanted to be spread very widely to the masses in 1969, no less. So at a very particular moment during the rise of the CIA-led counterculture movement. Feinberg opens by calling for the formulation of long-range goals of the human race, saying that he hopes to convince his readers that due to the increase in technological advances, it's imperative that humanity come up with uniformed goals, unify us all, and to alleviate disagreements over major issues that could lead to what he calls, quote-unquote, the early destruction of the human race, which is a very peculiar phrase, the early destruction of the human race. It suggests that there will be a planned destruction of the human race. He just doesn't want it to come early. The planned destruction of the human race has to do with transhumanism.
Transhumanists look forward to a future in which Homo sapiens is superseded by a better, smarter, fitter model, humanity 2.0.
And this idea that we will become something other than human once we transcend this phase of Homo sapien to the next level through directed human evolution. He's hinting at that with the language that he chooses to use here.
The fundamental hallmarks of the human species are about to be redesigned.
And he says, though, that these goals won't count unless it involves a large portion of the human race, so he's going to lay out what this goal should be for everyone. I just want to point out the fact that in this book, the entire idea is predicated on the claim that he makes that science has not shown any evidence for the existence of a soul or of God.
Just because we can't prove something scientifically doesn't mean it's not there. We can't prove a mother's love for her child, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It's a matter of the heart. And matters of the heart can't be fathomed by the mind.
So those don't exist because there's no evidence.
Now we're here at the Internet Archive, which is a former church.
But he then goes on to say, in the future, we may be able to find the aliens by using radio signals. So God and the soul are apparently just totally scientifically invalid concepts, but aliens, completely possible. I just think that point needs to be made. The purpose of this book, he says, is to propose a group effort, which I call the Prometheus Project. He goes on to claim that he chose that title simply because of the Greek word meaning foresight, but Prometheus was the legendary figure who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans, and was therefore sentenced to eternal torment. And many people have pointed out the parallels between Prometheus and Lucifer. It's pretty obvious. Lucifer means light bringer. He too was judged for bringing the knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve. So take that for what you will. Feinberg says that through technology, and especially communication and transportation, mankind is becoming homogenized and unified, which has been echoed all over the place, from the writings of the Bilderberg Group back during the 60s when they talked about technology being a key factor in globalization, to the logo on Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook hoodie. I mean, that's being pushed in our faces pretty much everywhere, which Feinberg says is an aspect of society's long-term evolution. But just as with many evolutionists, once you start actually reading their writings, you'll find this out real quick. Evolution is looked at as merely a platform for taking matters into one's own hands and directing human evolution. Because nature's too slow. I mean, this guy sounds like he got a lot of his talking points straight out of Julian Huxley and his document that he wrote as the first Director General of UNESCO, when he says things like, humanity can take a more direct route to a desired end than natural selection would. It also sounds like he is completely mirroring Jose Delgado's Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society book, which was published the same year. Interesting how all these guys just have the same exact opinion. It really is as if they feed all of these scientists at these Ivy League schools the same theories, the same lines of thinking, and the same talking points so that they all will emerge into the world parroting each other and pushing this same exact agenda. It really is. But he starts the book by saying that a new element is that we will soon have the option of changing man if we choose. He straight up admits he's calling for the use of technology to direct human evolution towards unification through these long-range goals in this Prometheus project that he's laying out. And his justification for this is, he says, my own feeling is that the despair of the conscious mind at the recognition of its own finitude is such that mankind cannot achieve abiding contentment. So, quote, a transformation of man into something very different from what he is now is called for. And then after that, he continuously uses phrases like reconstructing man into this new world man that they were building through technology after World War II. Specifically, he points out biologically and psychologically, since it is inevitably headed this way. They've made up their minds, that's what's going to happen, so we got to set some goals.
We have a post-human paradigm impending for our future, and so we want to prep people, we want to explain what that is, and because it's inevitable.
Then he spends the next 200 pages eerily setting up his case about what these nebulous goals are, before he finally admits in plain English what the main goal of this thing actually is. And on the way there, his book unfolds in the way that a horror film might, with little bits and pieces here and there, painting this ominous picture, before he finally just straight up says what he's getting at. He starts off by talking about the malleability of human behavior and pointing out the fact that scientists have proven that behavior can be conditioned, as demonstrated by Pavlov. He also brings up B.F. Skinner's Walden 2, which Feinberg describes as a provocative utopian novel outlining a society in which such techniques are used to engineer human behavior, as if that's a good thing.
Generate 30-year strategies that navigate technologies of fundamental importance for the future of life away from dystopia toward utopia.
Then he says, quote, To the extent that the human character is malleable through conditioning or otherwise, an inquiry into the goals of the human race must consider whether it would be desirable to instill some particular personality traits into all people. Not a few people, not some people, into everybody. Which means there's a mechanism they're going to have to use to do that. And somebody's going to have to make the decisions as to what those traits should be.
Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion. And that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed.
And then he claims that a, quote, revision in man's psyche might be more relevant to human happiness than any transformation of the environment might. And goes on to point out that while the use of LSD and external electric signals for behavior control may have led to concerns that these techniques could be used for evil, in his view, the method of manipulation is secondary to the goals being pursued. Because if those tools can be used to help reach the transhumanist goals for all of society, and that's going to make a happier society as a whole, then the goals are all that matter. It doesn't really matter how you get there. I mean, this is the kind of books that they were writing at this time period, but they're openly admitting this is where these influential scientists and people of power are trying to take society.
As a researcher, when I started looking at this 10 years ago, the big question was, well, if birds and bees and fish can amplify their intelligence by thinking together in systems, why can't people do it? And it turns out that people can do it. We just need to have the right technology to enable us to form these emergent systems.
And this is now, 50 years ago. So he goes on to say that technology will progress to a point that eventually major changes in human civilization will only take a single generation. And he points out that there's a time coming when our lives may be transformed so rapidly that the world in which a man is educated to live will no longer exist once he's an adult. And I would say that we're pretty much there, because the stuff that's being taught, at least here in America in our schools, is quite disconnected from the reality of the world and the job market that actually exists in the real world beyond the doors of schools these days. And Feinberg also notes that eventually, as we continue down this road of directed human evolution, which we've been on, like I said, for a while now, we're going to reach a point of no return. He says, the human way of life may change so drastically that there's no realistic possibility of returning to the previous way, which is seemingly the goal, actually. To make little changes gradually here and there until they start accumulating and the scale eventually gets tipped and then there's just no going back. Finally, towards the end of this book on page 180, he straight up lays it out and says, quote, the goal I propose for humanity is the creation of a universal consciousness. A universal consciousness. A hive mind. He just straight says it, that we're going to use technology to merge everyone's consciousness together, and that's where things are headed. Then he says something which makes no sense to me at all. He says this must be voluntary on the part of mankind, and it will eventually require the participation in the deepest sense of all men. How something that requires everyone to participate mandatorily can also remain voluntary is not explained by the scientist here. So he says this is going to be a gradual process that will require studies in consciousness, which sound a lot like, the CIA's Operation Stargate. And to make sure and hit that point home, he says that an avenue that could be explored is the attainment of distinctively different mental states by presently constituted men, perhaps a more intensive effort to induce and study mystic experiences occurring under the influence of various drugs, which is exactly what they went on to do after he wrote this book. And he's already kind of hinted at the fact that he was intimately in the know on some of the things that were going on in the MKUltra experimentation, or at least the science that was being studied that was feeding into that. He was quite well aware of that, since he only brings up electrical stimulation of the brain to affect change multiple times. Then he blatantly says we might expect to be able to initiate some of the qualitative changes in human consciousness. These might involve chemical and electrical stimulation of the brain or some form of biological engineering to produce individuals naturally capable of new forms of consciousness. Then, as if to add insult to injury, under a heading Philosophical Problems in Setting Goals, Feinberg straight up asks, should the goals of the human race be set by a small elite group or by as many people as wish to take part in the discussion? How many people do you think have been given the option to take part in such a discussion? I mean, if he adheres to anything else he's said up to this point, that shouldn't even be a question he's asking. But it's just thrown in your face. Then he goes on in the last chapter and says that the first step in achieving this goal of creating a universal consciousness for humanity, is to convince everyone through the use of the mass media to influence large fractions of the population via propaganda. So that's the stage we've been in for the last 50 years. Once you start researching this, you will see that this is the same sentiment that's been pushed everywhere, from the writings of leaders in the United Nations to the channeled writings of Alice Bailey to Julian Huxley's UNESCO document.
And that the peace must therefore be founded, if it is not to say, upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind.
All the way to the Google Selfish Ledger that we talked about on this channel last year. Part 3 is a Latin phrase, unus pro omnibus, which means one for all. I just think it's crazy that we're to a point in society now where these things aren't science fiction anymore. But here we have an actual scientist coming out and saying that the goal is to merge all of humankind into a universal consciousness through technology. So if you think control is bad now, I mean, when you start adding this together with the types of invasive brain technologies that are coming out right now, you're not even going to get to a point where you're going to know if your thoughts and feelings on the matter are even yours to begin with. I mean, people say democracy is so important. There's no democracy in this system. The amount of control will be very small group at the very, very top. And everyone else will just be part of the Borg.
The Borg! Thank you.
Resistance is futile.
I mean, we are entering a world of Neuralink brain-computer interfaces connected to the Internet of Things, running on a 5G, zero-latency network, and this has apparently been the stated goal for humanity underlying technology for half a century. And again, I also want to emphasize the fact that there were so many articles promoting this book when it came out in American newspapers that I lost count. That is how much they were trying to push this book and its ideas on the American public in 1969. So I think it's really weird that suddenly it's a rare book they're charging a lot for today, because they were promoting this book in every state across the entire nation at the time that it came out. And Prometheus handed off the torch to mankind. Fire, one of the earliest technologies, and the spark of inventions to come. In taking on this responsibility, we have seen the collateral damage that the development of ever more invasive technology has come at the expense of our humanity. These technologies are continuing to whittle everyone down into this molded personality, the New World Man, which is a role that primarily serves the larger system, not the individual. But this is how influential people inside the system view human progress. So next time you see that new agey "we are all one" propaganda, brush away the touchy-feely, flowery notions of it and just consider the logical conclusions of such statements. Because if it seems like we're being dehumanized at every turn right now, it's because we have to be, in order to get us to a place that these people have determined society must go in order to destroy Homo sapien as you know it and rebuild him as something else, transcending to the next phase of our directed human evolution. And there's nothing natural about any of it. A created universal consciousness is not a natural construct. It's not a natural way for human beings to exist or be. There's nothing natural about creating something like that through technology. There's quite literally no place for the individual in the future that's being built here. I mean, this wasn't written as a fiction novel. This is a non-fiction book written by a scientist connected to the Palo Alto scene, and this is a thing that was stated as a goal, and for what it's worth, it really does seem like he was able to get a lot of people on board for that, because look at where we are today.
And in the free exchange of ideas and knowledge, are agreed and determined to develop and to increase the means of communication between their peoples, and to employ these means for the purposes of mutual understanding and a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives.
New marketing patterns which have arisen in these United States over a surprisingly short span of years. The wonder which has made it all possible, of course, is the cyclops we have come to know as television.
And radio development for military purposes brought new techniques called microwave.
All of a sudden, computers are not the same as people, but they can really go back to that notion of making our lives, think of them as augmented humanity, making us better.
And you've actually said in the past that in the future, humans will be able to mentally contact anybody we want, see whatever image we want, and if we don't like it, we can just turn it off.
We'll put on a headset such that you can control the lights, turn on the TV, call for your car, tell your car where to go, type, dictate documents without ever touching a computer screen. And our children will wonder, how could you possibly live in a world where you had to touch the screen and you had a mouse and you had to type?
The internet there'll be so many IP addresses because of IPv6, so many devices, sensors, things that you're wearing, things that you're interacting with, that you won't even sense it. It'll be part of your presence all the time.
Like, we didn't evolve to have a communications jack.
I think the cure is mind reading.
Electrode to neuron interface.
Okay, what is it? Like, I'm gonna have like a plug in my head that's gonna fit into a hard drive? Like, or how does that work?
Yeah.
And I think we're gonna accept that cure.
Social media giant Facebook is in the process of acquiring Control Labs, a neural interface startup, between $500 million to a reported $1 billion. The startup is known for its software, which enables users to control computer devices with their brain.
The question at Control Labs is not how do we make our devices more capable, it's how do we ourselves become more capable. Neural interfaces are the root solution to this problem.
All of our lives are changed by the internet. Well, we are embarking on a path now where we will become the internet. The internet will become us.
As the examination of protein structures paved the way to genetic sequencing, the mass, multi-generational examination of actions and results could introduce a model of behavioral sequencing. As gene sequencing yields a comprehensive map of human biology, researchers are increasingly able to target parts of the sequence and modify them in order to achieve a desired result. As patterns begin to emerge in the behavioral sequences, they too may be targeted. The ledger could be given a focus, shifting it from a system which not only tracks our behavior, but offers direction towards a desired result.
I mean, this is a herd. This is a hive.
I think they're going to create a universal language. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think there's going to be a universal language that probably is augmented reality, some augmented reality language of shapes or something.
Some kind of symbolism.
Symbols.
This is also new. It's not new. I realize that nothing we've been doing is new. We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient. This technology is simply a route to powers that conjurers and alchemists used centuries ago. Human race lost that knowledge, and now I'm reclaiming it through virtual reality.
We plan to power more and more of our social infrastructure with Facebook to realize our vision of a socially connected VR ecosystem.
So there's one thing you know for certain, that is that you exist as a flesh and blood human being. My goal is to convince you otherwise.
But once you are connected to the internet, you are no longer trapped in your body. You can actually be anywhere at any time that any other person or any other device is getting sensory information.
The resulting superintelligence will not be alien, it will be human, just smarter and wiser. We might be able to solve some of the hardest problems we face, like poverty and inequality and sustainability. So the next time somebody uses the phrase hive mind as a negative, remember this: if honeybees could observe how we humans make big group decisions, like electing our leaders, or resolving our conflicts, or planning for our future, they might think we're the primitive ones, but not for long. Thanks.